started today. Welcome and thank you everyone for joining CF Leads for this 75-minute introductory webinar with Opportunity Insights and Leading on Opportunity, an entity of Foundation for the Carolinas, as we really look into transforming data into action. My name is Kelly Alexander, and I'm pleased to serve CF Leads as the Network Engagement Manager, and we're really thrilled that you joined us today. Please note a couple of housekeeping items that you can hear and see us, but we cannot hear or see you. You can use the question box for Q&A and the chat box to post any general comments and introduce yourselves. And we are going to be recording this, but if you have issues, technical or otherwise, please feel free to join us by phone. And we will be following up with some additional details in an email after this webinar. So at this point, it's my pleasure to welcome Mary Thomas, CF Leads President and CEO, to give us a formal welcome and to really get us started.
Thank you, Kelly, for that introduction, and certainly want to join Kelly in welcoming all of our guests here today for this webinar. We're so excited to have Opportunity Insights and Leading on Opportunity with us. And I want to also acknowledge our team, Economic Mobility team led by Dr. Leonard Brock, whom you'll be hearing from in just a little while. So as Kelly said, I am the president and CEO of CF Leads. I've had this opportunity now for about 18 months and certainly have enjoyed transitioning from a community foundation, the oldest community foundation in South Carolina, where I was in leadership for about 25 years and was able to really see the transformation of a community foundation that was doing extraordinary work, but it was based on the model that was started back in 1914, which was the banking model. The foundation was doing exceptional work in the charity arena, making grants, serving their donors. But the foundation hadn't yet really realized their full potential as a community leader. And CF Leads afforded us the opportunity to unlock the potential and the promise of what it means to be in place-based communities. And it didn't take long for our foundation to really take off and start leading and convening and being an initiative manager and really stepping up into its role to be more than a grant maker. And therein lies the real purpose of CF Leads. We are the country's national network of community foundations committed to community leadership. You know, what Mr. Goff started in 1914 was innovative for his time. And the legacy that he left is one now that we continue to build upon, saying that we can serve donors and do transactional work, but we can do the other work as well, and that is serve our community. Really bringing together community and donors to truly have impact. And we know here at CF Leads, hundreds of community foundations from across the U.S. come together. And what our job is to help strengthen their bandwidth, strengthen their community leadership muscle. We share innovations and we tackle some of the critical issues of our time. When we talk about community leadership here at CF Leads, we really talk about the community foundation seeing itself as a partner in their place-based community or work, uniting and inclusively bringing people together to really consider what matters. And what matters to one community may be different than what matters to another. But the point is that our framework helps community foundations exercise their will, make sure they have the values and the culture and the tools to really advance work. And we know that we're living in a time now in a challenged civil society where there's a lot going on in the world. All you need to do is turn the television on and you'll see it for yourself. And we realize that community foundations are hidden gems that are positioned to unlock change across America. The field is growing. It continues to grow over the last couple of decades that I've been in community foundation work. We've seen the field evolve from about 400 or 500 community foundations to now almost 950 community foundations are leading change across the country and are addressing complex issues. But despite the momentum, we know that there's still lots of work to be done to help, again, build capacity so that change can happen at the local level. And ultimately, we can achieve collective impact. I believe here, coming here as the new CEO, I am really committed to doing the work now. Dr. King once said that tomorrow is too late. And that's the urgency in which I come to this seat and to the work that we do each day, is that tomorrow is too late. Our communities are depending on us to be bold, to be courageous, and to use all of our capitals to advance progress within our communities. So at CF Leads, our mission is to help community foundations build strong communities. And we want to do that by advancing effective practices. We share knowledge, whether you're going through our Executive Leadership Institute for CEOs, VPs, or even a community of practice. That's one of the ways that we share knowledge. Even today with this webinar, we're sharing knowledge that we hope will help you advance your work. Galvanizing action, we serve as a catalyst to help community foundations achieve collective impact. So at the end of the day, 250 community foundations we are trying to get on the ladder of community leadership. We want to help 125 community foundations move up the ladder. How do we move from being at the very bottom in terms of just beginning to tap into this work to now moving up up the ladder for collective impact once again? So again, today, we just come to you with a lot of excitement, a lot of passion. I have lived experience and professional experience in doing this work, and I know what it looks like when you move from not just doing the transactional work, but being a partner in community, working with public sector entities such as your county government, your city government, to your local United Ways, to Health Legacy Foundations, to anyone who cares about community. The Community Foundation, I would argue any day of the week, is where the action really happens. So with that, I want to thank you again for being here today. I want to thank you for the opportunity to welcome you to this webinar, and I will now turn it over to Dr. Leonard Brock.
Thank you, Mary, for your inspiring words and for setting the stage. I'm delighted to be here with you all today. I also want to thank our partners from Opportunity Insights and Leading on Opportunity for joining us today for this webinar. Your leadership in the field is critical, and we are grateful for your willingness to share your insights with community foundations across the country. Economic mobility, as we know, is of critical importance to the community foundations within the field. Last year, we spent time directly hearing from community foundations about the specific areas of economic mobility they want to address. What we learned is that there's a real hunger for tools and strategies to help accelerate and amplify the work already underway, or to jumpstart work that is of importance and priority in communities at the infancy stage of their economic mobility strategies. CF Leads recognizes that community foundations are at the forefront of this work, and today's conversation is about equipping you with one of the most powerful tools available, which is data. Today's webinar is part of an effort to reach community foundations more broadly and more widely. We understand that not all foundations have the capacity or time to engage in more intensive activities like our regional convenings or our high-touch engagements, such as our Economic Mobility Action Network, which we often refer to as EMON. Webinars like this provide what we call a light touch opportunity, which is an accessible way to introduce key tools and information that you can take back to your communities, regardless of where you are on your economic mobility journey. Today, we're excited to introduce you to the Opportunity Atlas, one of several critical resources we're highlighting as part of a broader work on economic mobility. Opportunity Insights, our strategic content partner, has developed this tool to help communities better understand local data and how it can be used to drive more equitable outcomes. Opportunity Insights is one of the strategic partners we are working with in this space. Alongside Urban Institute and Results for America, Opportunity Insights is helping us to equip community foundations with the data and tools needed to accelerate and amplify the work on economic mobility. This work is generously supported by the Gates Foundation, and all of us, including our colleagues at Opportunity Insights, are part of a community of practice facilitated by Results for America, and this allows us to share learnings, best practices, and strategies to support the field. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the critical role of Leading an Opportunity, an entity of the Foundation for the Carolinas. Leading an Opportunity is participating in the upcoming cohort of our Economic Mobility Action Network, which, as I previously shared, is a more intensive, high-touch engagement designed to help community foundations lead the way on economic mobility with a racial equity lens. For those of you who may be hearing about EMON for the first time, this is one of our flagship initiatives designed to bring community foundations together in a collaborative learning environment where they can develop strategies, policies, practices to drive real impact in their communities. As you hear from our speakers today, I encourage you to think about how you might use the tools and information they present in your local context. Whether you're just getting started or have been working in this space for a while, there's something here for everyone. Remember, data is just the beginning. It's not the end goal. It's a tool to help inform strategy and policy, which ultimately drive the outcomes we're all striving to achieve. As CF Leads, we are committed to supporting your journey, no matter where you are. After today's session, we'll be sharing additional resources, including opportunities for follow-up discussions, office hours, and links to some of the tools we're highlighting today. Again, thank you for joining us. We're excited to see how you leverage these tools to continue advancing economic mobility in your communities. And with that being said, I would like to turn things over to my colleagues at Opportunity Insights, who will now take the platform.
Thanks so much, Leonard, and the team at CF Leads. We are thrilled to be here today to talk with you more about our research and the Opportunity Atlas as a whole. I believe before we jump into our presentation, the CF Leads team is going to launch a brief survey for everybody. And while that's happening, I will pull up my slides. We'll just take a moment for folks to fill this out and look at the results together, and then we'll jump right in. Okay. Thanks everyone for participating in that. I think this is just helpful context for everybody on the call. I think you can see those results now just to understand the extent to which folks have used these tools before. So thank you so much for taking a moment to do that. So my name is David Forte. I lead our research translation work at Opportunity Insights. I'm joined by my colleague Emily Leff, who will jump in a minute to preview the Opportunity Atlas for you all. But before we do that, a bit about our organization. So we are a research to policy lab based at Harvard University, and our team studies the concept of economic mobility. And we do that using a big data approach. We have unique data sharing partnerships with US Census, the US Treasury, tax records, which allows our team to have a really global perspective on residents in the United States to understand what mobility looks like at geographic levels, broad and both hyper-local. It allows us to also create linkages across those data sets to tell a picture of what economic mobility looks like longitudinally across time. So with our time today, I'll take a bit to describe some of the research around the geography of opportunity and social capital. We'll look at a few examples recently that we've seen of foundations applying this research and data in their work. And then, as I mentioned, my colleague Emily will do a quick preview of the Opportunity Atlas for you all. So one of the key ways that we think about and look at the data related to economic mobility is through the lens of geography. And so what we see here nationally is a depiction of the average household income for children in adulthood, so at age 35, for kids who grew up in low-income families. So we do this by linking census and tax records. We measure children's income in adulthood, and then we link them back to the places which they spent the most time growing up as a child. We can understand the impact of place, neighborhood, and geography in terms of how it translates to outcomes in adulthood. What we can see just looking at this nationally is there's stark differences across the country. Places in the southeast of the United States, the red areas of the map, show that children go on to have much lower opportunity relative to other places, the Midwest, parts of the Central Plains and the coast, where we see that greenish, bluish shading area where kids growing up in similarly resourced families, so all low-income families, go on to have much greater outcomes in adulthood. And this is interesting to look at nationally to understand these regional patterns across the country. We can also, because of the nature of this data, zoom in to any place in America, city, county, et cetera. And here we're looking at, as an example, Memphis, Tennessee. And the geographic boundaries we see here are census tracts. These are areas that have around 4,000 individuals residing within them. And the first thing I think that's important to notice is that the color scale is still the same. Even within a specific place, we have the deepest reds to the darkest blues, all within one single metro area. And when you kind of zoom in even further, just to focus on a 1 to 2 mile radius within a particular city, you can see that neighborhood by neighborhood, outcomes for kids growing up in these places can be dramatically different. You know, living on one side of the street in an apartment complex versus the other could be a difference of, you know, $10,000 to $20,000 in average annual household income in adulthood. So this is to say that the roots of mobility and the policies that impact that really come down to local level policies and programs. And as we've done this analysis of the geography of opportunity, these are some of the characteristics that we've seen of higher opportunity, the bluer places on the map. So the first is lower poverty rates. Places that have lower poverty concentration tend to have higher levels of upward mobility, more stable family structures. So the increased presence of two-parent households within a particular region tends to matter quite a bit. Not so much that your own household growing up is two parents, but that the broader community that you're exposed to has a higher level of two-parent households within it. Better school quality, so both from a K-12 standpoint, but also in terms of access to post-secondary options. And then finally, greater social capital, or the extent to which high and low income folks are making meaningful connections with one another. And I want to take a minute to elaborate a bit on this. Our team has they've done a bit of separate research exclusively on the topic of social capital. One of the strongest outcomes that came out of this work is the concept of economic connectedness. And this can be explained kind of 50-50 by two different factors. So the first is exposure, or you could say the extent to which high and low income folks are in a particular place, school, area with one another. So is there socioeconomic diversity within a place? And then the other half of that is the concept of friending. So conditional on having that exposure, like knowing that we have high and low income folks in the same place together, are they forming meaningful relationships with one another, or are they not? Are they kind of, you know, maintaining their social circles with folks who have similar socioeconomic backgrounds to themselves? And when we step out nationally, on the left-hand side here, we have the same national map that we just looked at, the geography of opportunity, mapping where the average incomes of kids in adulthood, so upward economic mobility geographically. On the right-hand side, we have this concept of economic connectedness. So where in America do we see higher levels of social capital? And you can notice that these two maps are quite similar. And in fact, this is one of the strongest predictors that our team has found in the research related to economic mobility, the concept of social capital and economic connectedness. And this plays out also at the local level. So here I've zoomed in to the area of Charlotte, where we have our partners on the webinar with us as well. And you can see how these patterns play out similarly, where you have higher levels of economic mobility, particularly in the south eastern portion of Charlotte. You also see higher levels of economic connectedness and vice versa. So these two concepts of social capital and economic connectedness, very closely related to upward economic mobility. Another way that we've looked at this data more recently, this summer, our team released a new research paper that was focusing on changes. So not so much, you know, opportunity as a static construct, like where does it exist and where does it not, but understanding more about how places can change. And so here, what we're looking at nationally is a similarly shaded image, but the measure here is the change in children's incomes in adulthood. And it's measuring it between two different time periods, kids born in 1978 versus kids born in 1992. And so this is helpful for us to understand, what does it take and what does it look like for places to change over a period of time? Can opportunity shift? And in what ways is it doing that? And this is really the first glimpse into this kind of time-lapse indicator of how opportunity is shifting. And so importantly here, the measure is a percentage and not so much a dollar value. But excuse me, there we go. Just as we did in the Opportunity Atlas image originally, you can zoom into local levels, and you can do that in this second module of the Opportunity Atlas and this new data on changing opportunity as well. And you can see by population type how those incomes in adulthood are shifting. So here we've zoomed into what's happening in the Charlotte community, and you can see how incomes are shifting by race across these two time periods. So in Charlotte, it was one of the areas in the US that experienced some of the greatest positive shifts in upward mobility. So many of these lines, as you can see, are shifting to the right. But I think it's really helpful from a place-based standpoint to be able to disaggregate in this way and think about the policies, the programs that were taking place, how communities were changing during, say, the 1990s and 2000s that could have impacted these outcomes that we're seeing in this data today. And our team did a bit more to really articulate and pinpoint what is the factor, like what is it that's really affecting the changes that we're seeing in this new data. And it came down to two kind of concepts. So the first is parental employment rate, and we use this as kind of a broader proxy for community conditions in general. We saw similar correlations between changes in mobility and changes in household marriage rates, ACT and SAT scores. But parental employment rates is kind of the primary outcome that we're using in the research to describe how these things are connected. And where we see higher levels of parental employment rates shift upward, we also tend to see shifts upward in terms of opportunity and prospects for kids in adulthood. And these are kind of refined even more by this concept of social interaction or the community that children are exposed to while they're growing up. So it's not so much parental employment rates in general, but the parental employment rates of the families and households that you would interact with as a kid. So coming back to the concept of race, socioeconomic status, and neighborhood. Who is it that you're exposed to, and what are the changes in that social community that really impact your outcomes in adulthood? But I think this data, as we've talked about it more with folks, it doesn't offer any prescriptions, right? It's not telling you what programs are working and which aren't. So we know this is a bit unsatisfying. It's kind of these general insights into how things are changing, but not really lending particular programmatic interventions that are promising. So our team is doing a lot more work around this place-based concept right now. We're looking at programs like Hope 6 and communities and schools. And in the coming year or so, we hope to have a lot more evidence to speak to kind of how places are changing and what those specific mechanisms are behind place-based change. Okay, I'm going to shift now to talk a bit about some of the recent examples we've seen of foundations that are using this data in their work. So the first comes from a foundation in the Pittsburgh area, the Richard King Mellon Foundation. And here I have kind of two examples from this group. The first is around a program that they're funding to really do somewhat of a landscape assessment to understand what types of programs within Allegheny County in the Pittsburgh area are really fostering this concept of economic connectedness. So to try to understand more about what's happening in their area related to this work. I think there's a lot of programmatic work that's happening where folks don't really identify as doing social capital work. But this is a grant to really unpack, if you're a youth serving program, do you have an element that's really focused on social capital that wasn't really elevated, right, in your program model, but it's there underneath. And so trying to understand that landscape. The second is more of a direct intervention where they're using this Lego Brick Club to kind of build cross-class connections amongst kids in the area through this concept of play. So seeing how this activity can really build relationships across class lines. Another example from the St. Louis area, we're seeing the Marillac Mission Fund they've kind of constructed an entire grant making portfolio, really focused on improving economic mobility, and they're citing this data from our team directly in how it's motivating this work, right? So focusing on economic mobility, pointing to the research, focusing more so on this concept of social capital. So we see this as kind of an exciting way that the data is being used to really hone and target and inform grant making efforts. And then finally, I think this is an example of that type of work, but also more of an example of how a community foundation can kind of catalyze broader change within a community. So our team, our colleagues from Leading an Opportunity on the phone, which I'll speak more to this in a moment, but the Foundation for the Carolinas, they were really the catalyst for the formation of Leading on Opportunity, which has since gone on to inspire tons more investment in economic mobility programs to motivate the broader community around this concept in a really unique way that's impacted the community tremendously, I think, over the course of their lifespan as an organization. But it all started with this inspiration and the spark from a community foundation. So I think that's really inspiring to see. Okay, before we jump into the Opportunity Atlas demo, I just wanted to highlight kind of 3 ways we think that this tool can be useful for folks as they're using it. So the first, it's a way to really explore the data, right? You can zoom in and out of areas, into neighborhoods, understand what economic mobility looks like in your region, for whom, and also see now how it's changing, right? We talked about that new component where you can see trends across time. The second is to catalyze support. So I think, as we talked about in these examples, many folks are doing community work, but don't necessarily identify with the concept of economic mobility. They think of themselves more as an education organization or a workforce organization, but really galvanizing the community around this concept of economic mobility through this data, I think, is a really powerful way to use it. And then finally, targeting strategies. So in doing this, in using this tool, you can zoom into a particular neighborhood area and see where there is greatest need. You can filter by population type, by race, by gender, by parent income to see by subgroups where is there the greatest need, and really hone and target interventions in a particular way. So with that, and I wanted to also say, sorry, I forgot this was animated in here. We think community foundations are really uniquely positioned in this work. You have, I think, flexibility in ways that other funding streams don't necessarily have to test out new ideas and push grantees, folks doing programmatic work in new directions. And so, as I've elevated in those examples that I shared, so just really excited to be with you all today to share this work, and looking forward to the conversation to follow. I'll pass it over now to my colleague Emily, who will do a quick demo of the Opportunity Atlas itself.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Emily, and I work at Opportunity Insights. I'm on the research translation team with David, and I'm going to be doing a brief overview of the Opportunity Atlas and how you can use it to look at data for economic mobility in your region. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So I'll just say up top, there are a lot of different ways that you can look at the data in the Opportunity Atlas, a lot of different, paths you can go down. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just going to go pretty broad strokes and show you just how to orient yourself to the data, what you're looking at, and all of those good things. But we really do encourage you to take some time and sit down, open it up, and do some digging of your own to, unlock those insights that the data might illuminate for you. So here we are looking at the map that shows economic outcomes in adulthood. So David had this map open in his slides. And basically, the metric that we're looking at here is for a child who grows up, in a given region, what can they expect to earn in income as an adult? And so We're seeing some national patterns where there are some red regions over here, there's some blue regions over here. But as we know, national data, while important, is less helpful when we're thinking about community-specific work. So I'm going to zoom in on a community, and I'm going to zoom in on Charlotte. And so when we zoom in on a particular community, as David had mentioned as well in his presentation, we can see the vast array of economic mobility outcomes at the local level as well. So here in Charlotte, we can see that there are some neighborhoods, like up here, where children born to low-income households see worse outcomes in adulthood. We can also see that, nearby there's some regions where a child who's born into a low-income household but grew up in this tract sees better outcomes in adulthood. And so with this, we can also look at it at specific races or genders or parent income groups, which is helpful when you're thinking about, targeting intervention. So, if you are working in particular communities or trying to reach specific groups, understanding the mobility trends or mobility outcomes for that group can kind of help you paint that picture. So, for example, there might be some tracts where low-income Black children and low-income white children are seeing different outcomes in adulthood. And so, if you're trying to target a specific intervention, that's, important to know. So as we know, economic mobility is multifaceted, and it's not something that's just a factor of one thing. It's a factor of many things, like schools, housing, family stability. As David showed in his slide, there are many different characteristics of high opportunity and high mobility neighborhoods. And so here on the left-hand side, we have some additional data that can help you kind of flesh out and provide more context on the regions that you're looking at. So right now, like, the metric that we're looking at is the income in adulthood. But we can also look at things like poverty rate. We can see here that the patterns of poverty seem to be pretty similar to the patterns of opportunity. So, this suggests how poverty concentration affects children's opportunity in adulthood. We can also look at things like fraction non-white, and we can see, perhaps patterns of redlining or historic racial segregation. Things like that might also play a role in the economic mobility in a certain region. So there are many more factors that you can look at here and kind of start to understand different patterns. And this is where it's helpful to sort of bring in your local knowledge and local context of what you know about this area. Because the data in the Opportunity Atlas, we hope that it's very helpful, but also it's only as helpful if it's paired with local knowledge and context of, the policies and programs and things like that that are happening in a given region that might be contributing to economic mobility. I'm going to also just briefly show you our second module that we added more recently this past summer that shows data for how mobility has changed over time. So this was one of the later maps that David was showing in his slides. So if we go back to Charlotte, we can see on the county level here that between children who were born in 1978, who grew up in Charlotte in the 80s, and their income here is measured when they're 27, so around 2005. So between them and then the children who were born in 1992, grew up in Charlotte in the 90s, and their income was measured at age 27 in 2019. We can see that outcomes for children growing up in Charlotte to low-income households have actually improved over this time, which is really great and encouraging to see. And I'm sure that AJ will speak more on this and be able to provide a lot more detail and context than I can. But just wanted to show that we have a few new ways of looking at these mobility trends by group here. So we can see here that nationally, between these two birth cohorts, we saw outcomes decline. In Charlotte, we saw a different story where outcomes improved. And we can also, again, look at this by race, by parent income, and by gender to understand what was happening for children born into different circumstances during these times. So, for example, if we're looking at low-income Black children, we saw a pretty significant improvement in economic outcomes. I can also compare this to outcomes from low-income white children who saw relatively stable outcomes between these two birth cohorts. And we can see here that even with the improvements for low-income Black children, there is still such a persistent earnings gap. And so I think I saw in the Q&A, someone had asked a question about, if I'm remembering correctly, like narrative around places where outcomes are improving. And so I guess this might help partially answer that, but you know, even as economic outcomes improve, there's always more work to be done, always more room to grow. And so I think that in understanding how mobility has changed for different groups within your community, you can kind of drill down a bit more and offer perhaps more tailored and data-driven, you know, programming or you know, funding programs that are more specific to the groups where they're seeing improvements, or maybe they have yet to see improvements. So that is the end of my demonstration, but I just wanted to shout out that David and I offer office hours twice a week. I think he will send the Calendly link in there. So this is just a very low stakes way. If you know, you're exploring the data and you have questions about understanding it in your community, you can sign up for an office hours slot here, and we're happy to talk you through what you're seeing and answer any questions that you have. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to AJ.
Hey folks, good to be with everybody. I think I had seen Kelly post in the chat, maybe a desire to stop for questions for a moment. I want to see, Kelly, if you want to entertain some questions, or I can go straight in and we can do them at the end.
Yes, I'll actually raise the questions during the Q&A, and David was very responsive in the actual chat. So if you can just proceed, and then I'll follow up with the questions in the chat during the Q&A following your conversation.
Okay, great. Well, I am so excited to be with y'all today and share a bit about what we're doing here in Charlotte. I think in the original bill, we were expecting my colleague Sherry Chisholm to join us as well. Unfortunately, she is under the weather today, so you've got me. I'll try my best to share the story, but hopefully there'll be future opportunities to hear from Sherry later. I'll just begin with a little bit of an agenda, kind of talking about where I want to go over the course of the next few moments. I'll begin by talking about the history of the work on economic mobility here at Foundation for the Carolinas and through Leading on Opportunity, and how that has led to progress for our community. I'll then zoom out and talk more specifically about kind of the model that we use at Leading on Opportunity and how we leverage that to drive change across systems. And then we'll click down within that to look specifically at the role of data in that systems change model. So to get started, I want to give you a little bit of a sense of kind of the story of this work. So back in 2014, Raj Chetty and the folks at Opportunity Insights put out this study that has become known, at least in Charlotte, as the Chetty study. And it, in an appendix, made rankings of cities, the 50 largest cities in the United States, in terms of a child's ability to rise out of poverty if born into it. And this study really ran a shockwave through Charlotte. I think for some folks, this study was a recognition of a reality that existed for a long time. And for other folks, this was shockingly new news, particularly because Charlotte was generally at this point in time at the top of so many lists of cities with the most millennials moving, most breweries per capita, expanding economy, what have you. Charlotte was not used to being at the bottom of the list. And so one of the things you're seeing here on this slide is a headline that our local newspaper, the Charlotte Observer, put out around the time that this study was released: "Land of Opportunity, not by a long shot." This catalyzed work led by the Community Foundation, but which convened individuals from across sectors to develop a report. If we were going to take action on this and change not only the narrative, but also the outcomes for children and families in our community, such that we would no longer be 50th out of 50, what would it take? This report was released in 2017, and it contained about 100 recommendations and strategies for what it would look like to advance this work in Charlotte. One of the critical recommendations from that report was the creation of an entity that would be housed at the Community Foundation, but which would help to bring together funders and nonprofits to help drive action across the system for how would we implement all of these recommendations and take action on all of these strategies. And that really led to, first, through COVID, we had the opportunity to kind of evaluate what was working, what wasn't. I think really a moment to kind of pause and think through the way we're tackling these things. But it really led to a comprehensive approach that leans on 3 pillars: data, strategy, and policy, to tackle these challenges at the systems level. I'll speak more to what it looks like to use those pillars here in a moment. But one of the other pieces that I think is a critical part of this story is that as we have tried to do this work here, one of the really important factors that has helped us to galvanize energy from across sectors and across corners of the work has been data. It's been a way that we were able to bring together information into a tool we call the Opportunity Compass, which lets folks track outcomes that are maybe predictive, or what we call key drivers of some of the things that David and Emily just spoke to. So I'll talk about that in a bit as well. But as we've been working on this over the course of the past 10 years, we were really excited to hear in 2024, just earlier this year, that we are no longer 50th out of 50. We have risen to 38 out of 50 here in Charlotte. And as David and Emily alluded to in their work, we are 3rd overall in terms of progress. I think it's important to call out at this point that while we're excited to see Charlotte moving up in the rankings, we want our disposition at Leading on Opportunity to be less of a zero-sum game. So although these things often happen on a scale of 1 to 50, we think that the work that we're doing in Charlotte hopefully can help communities across the country that want to develop ways to advance this work in their communities, such that it doesn't mean that one community has to go down. Everyone can come up together. One of the big drivers of our improvement in outcome was this chart that you just had a chance to look at through the exploration of the Atlas. This here is the same data that Emily just shared from Module 2 of the Atlas. This really is, for us, an opportunity to connect data across these national tools and bring them down to a local focus. What does it look like for Leading on Opportunity to do this work in the local way, taking cues from national data, but really particularizing this in our own space? Well, when we talk about our work at Leading on Opportunity, what we say our mission is to help partners across Charlotte and Mecklenburg County solve the kind of social challenges that are so complex that no single person or organization or governmental body could tackle on their own. It took us an incredibly long time, 400 years, some may say, to create the problems of inequity that this country has baked into the challenges of economic mobility. And it's going to take us quite a long time to solve these things, but we're not going to be able to solve it just with one entity. We're going to need to bring organizations together across sectors to solve these challenges. And so Leading on Opportunity really sees it to be our role to create clarity out of the complexity and to create alignment from the fragmentation that comes from organizations trying to collaborate in the midst of that complexity. As I said, we talk about this work in 3 pillars: data, strategy, and policy. We see these things as interrelated but sequenced aspects to the work. So when we think about the role of data, we say that data helps us identify where the gaps are in our systems. If we think about data as the finish line, then I think we've over-realized the possibility of what data can do for us. Data, and particularly when you think about tools like the Atlas, it helps us see the landscape. What are the outcomes and how are things varying across subgroups? Get a very clear picture of where the work ought to happen, but measurement is not the destination. Measurement is only the lens through which we see where we need to be taking action. So that brings us to the second pillar, which is strategy. This helps us organize, whether it be funders, whether it be nonprofits, whether it be grassroots organizations or government entities. How do we bring those folks together to deliver the kinds of programs and interventions that will close the gaps that we see in those data? And finally, policy, the third pillar, and one that I think I may argue is the most important of the 3. Policy works at the systems and structural level to change the conditions that caused the gaps to create in the first place. And so when we think about the interrelation of data, of strategy, and of policy, we see that these things build on one another. And in some ways, data moves to strategy, moves to policy. But in other ways, you can see the way in which strategy and policy change the data such that when we go from 2014 to 2024, we can see progress happening over time. I'd love to spend time talking about all of these things, but I know our remit today is to talk about data. So that's what I'll do. I'll start with our tool that we use here in Charlotte called the Opportunity Compass. And I'll, in a moment, talk about the way that it's connected to some of these national tools that were mentioned earlier in the call. So when we think about the Opportunity Compass, we talk about this as Charlotte's tool for tackling economic mobility, doing that work of helping us to identify where are the gaps and where might we want to intervene. And in that way, we talk about the compass as not a measurement tool, not an accountability tool, but a strategy tool that's really aimed at doing that work of drawing clarity out of the complexity that surround these challenges. And the compass has 3 primary aims. The first is to help us discover what are the key drivers of economic mobility. And to do that, I'll talk more about this shortly. We leverage some of the data coming from national partners that Leonard spoke about at the beginning. Secondly, we can look at the community data on these drivers over time, whether that be drawing on national sources or whether we're able to find hyperlocal data that really help us drill down on what are the ways that trends are varying across neighborhoods and across subgroups to get a very clear picture about, are we moving in the right direction and where do we need to lean in further? And third, and most powerfully, having these data organized in this way and tracked across time allows us to do the work of alignment. How do we get programs and investments moving in the same direction so that we use not only common language, but common metrics, and those common metrics help us to get folks moving in the same direction so that we're making progress in the areas that are most critical to improving economic mobility in our community. As I said, I want to spend just a moment talking about the way in which we leverage national research to create local impact. So I talked about the way that the compass answers this question, where should Charlotte focus? And it does that by identifying what are the key drivers, tracking progress over time, and mapping the actions of funders and nonprofits to these drivers. In the compass, we are able to leverage an immense body of knowledge that comes from outside our community and really particularize it for our local context. And the way that we think about this is that these three public goods help us to answer three interrelated questions. What you saw in the Atlas helps us to understand what's happened. It looks at long-term data on economic mobility outcomes, how they change over time, and lets us get clear about where in Charlotte, by geography and by subgroup, are these things varying, where do gaps exist, and what over the long-term time horizon should we be focused on. Once we know that, we then need to think about what would we do in a shorter time horizon. And so through the Compass and through aligning some of the Compass's metrics with the Urban Institute's mobility metrics, we're able to answer the question, what can we measure? What are the likely, Urban calls them predictors? We use the language of the key drivers of economic mobility. What are the things that if we were to focus in these areas, these would drive positive outcomes on the data that we see in the Atlas? And if we wanted to think about what would we measure, the next natural question would be, what works? Once we see those key drivers of economic mobility, we then need to think about what are the proven practices and policies that can be implemented to drive outcomes. And this is where we leverage the Results for America Economic Mobility Catalog, as well as local work similar to what David mentioned is happening in Pittsburgh. We do similar activities here through our policy research arm of Leading on Opportunity to try to determine what are the things that if we were to implement these programs or pass these policies, we would be able to change the predictive measures, which would ultimately influence outcomes over the long term. All of these pieces work together to create a comprehensive picture of how we can make change and then allow us to bring folks together to drive that action, which is exactly what we do through the Compass. Not only do we gather data on, for instance, one of the five what we call determinants of economic mobility is child and family stability. Within this bucket, we're measuring things like two-parent families in neighborhoods, just like David and Emily mentioned, they're tracking. We measure the affordability of housing. We measure how close folks live to grocery stores. You're seeing about 12 measures here. We're in the process of expanding these based on work we've been doing with Urban and other partners over the course of the year. And what we're able to do is not only track these data, but as I said earlier, the real powerful part of this is to map investments onto these. So we can see which of these are moving in the right direction and where are the dollars flowing related to this. And not only where are the dollars flowing, but who is taking action on this in the nonprofit space. This is a way in which community foundations can use data to drive alignment. And by leveraging the power of data and the power of data storytelling, we can get folks focused on the same things so that we're moving in the same direction. I think something that I often hear from, not only within our context at Foundation for the Carolinas, but for community foundations across the country is, we're not like your standard philanthropy. We don't have unlimited discretionary funds to deploy in this direction, but we do have influence. And that's where I think using data, we can influence our partners, whether they be other philanthropies, whether they be our grantees, whether they be other stakeholders in our community, to catalyze collective action and collective impact on some of these challenges. So what I've got here listed is just some of the ways that I think community foundations, as Mary said at the beginning of this, have a unique ability to take action on economic mobility challenges. Not only can we catalyze collaboration and align funding like we're doing through the Opportunity Compass and the example that I just lifted up, but we can bring together stakeholders across sectors as Foundation for the Carolinas did in building the task force report. I think one of the most meaningful things that community foundations can do that really makes our kind of organizations unique is we can leverage relationships with individual wealth holders, which the most recent Giving USA study says is about 2/3 of all giving in the United States. We're one of the only kinds of entities in the country that can communicate to these individuals what's working, what's not, and where should we be directing dollars in our communities. And tools like the Compass help us to tell that story, not only to institutional funders and nonprofits, but also the individual wealth holders who are some of the largest donors to these critical programs and interventions in our communities. I think as we think about the elections coming up and we think about the way that some of the local elections that will be down ballot impact this work as well, community foundations have a unique opportunity to work across political cycles to maintain focus, as we've done at Foundation for the Carolinas and Leading on Opportunity over the course of decades, and not just terms in office. And as has been spoken to already on this call, we're able to invest in research and innovation to build groups like Leading on Opportunity that, while we're still learning and building what we're doing here in Charlotte, we can think about this and be a kind of research and action practice lab in a community that's trying to figure out ways to get everyone moving in the same direction, can act as the conductor of the orchestra or the air traffic controller for all of the work that's happening across our communities. So although I wish I could spend 90 minutes or 5 hours telling you all about our data work and how exciting it's been to try to do this work here in Charlotte, we want to make time for questions here in this space together. And so what I'll say is similar to the office hours that Opportunity Insights has provided. If we can be a partner to y'all in your journey, we would be happy to connect. My information is here on this slide, and I'm sure the CF Leads folks can circulate this afterwards. We've been down the road of this work before, and certainly, as I said, we don't know everything that there is to know. And certainly we have not solved these challenges in Charlotte. We have a long way to go to create the kind of equitable community that the Compass quantifies for us. But as one of the folks on our board says often, we've stubbed our toe many times and learned a few things along the way. So if you're facing similar challenges to the ones that I've described, we'd be happy to connect and have conversations about what we've learned and maybe the context that you're in. We'd love to learn about the efforts that are happening in communities that are like ours, trying to figure out ways to leverage these national resources, pair them with local knowledge, and really create meaningful change in our communities. So thank you so much for including Charlotte in this conversation. We're really honored to be here.
Thank you, AJ. Thank you, David. Thank you, Emily, for your insights and for the rich information you shared. We have a few minutes here, and I want to engage in some Q&A. So David and Emily, if you can come on video, that would be great. We did receive a few questions in advance of the webinar, so I actually will launch us into the Q&A with asking those two questions. And we have roughly 10 minutes or so. So the first question I want to ask either of you is, how can intermediaries working with schools leverage these insights to close opportunity gaps?
Yeah, I can take that one. I mean, I think with the Opportunity Atlas, it allows you to explore these outcomes geographically. So within that, there's an element of kind of understanding school catchment areas and where kids grow up, which schools they're going to, and what those outcomes are in adulthood. So there's that piece. I think a tool that we didn't showcase today, but is a companion to the Opportunity Atlas, the Social Capital Atlas. Through the nature of this data, it was a partnership with Facebook, and one of the data points within Facebook information is school, which people voluntarily offer up for their profiles. So within that tool, the Social Capital Atlas, you can actually look at that concept of economic connectedness, which I was talking about at the high school level. So you can see, for instance, do particular high schools in your area have a high degree of socioeconomic segregation? Are kids that attend those schools likely to befriend folks from different socioeconomic backgrounds? I think one practical example that we've seen in the Dallas, Texas area, there was a school that physically had two separate cafeterias. So one was for kids who took advantage of the free and reduced lunch program, and another for kids who did not. And so just by design, this created this dramatic segregation of students from a socioeconomic standpoint and created different social environments in which those kids were exposed to. So they reconstructed this school in a new way and kind of adjusted for that. But it was just kind of a glaring example of how friending could be physically augmented through the the space in which kids are exposed to in the school environment.
I can tack on just another example of the way Charlotte has used this social capital atlas. The school that had the best outcomes here in Charlotte is a school called Northwest School of the Arts, which, unlike a lot of the other traditional high schools in our area, focuses on bringing together folks across backgrounds around common interests. And I think that was a really powerful insight for folks in our community to learn that something like the arts or other kinds of hobbies and extracurricular activities could be a really powerful way of bridging some of these economic connectedness kinds of challenges that we face. And so leveraging the data in the Social Capital Atlas, I think was really powerful for us as we think about designing those sorts of things and bringing them into schools more broadly.
Thank you. Thank you. The chat is very active, and I know David has been working, responding to various questions. So I'm actually going to lift a few of the questions that were raised in the chat. And AJ, this is one for you. How is Leading on Opportunity getting the investment tracking data? Is it comprehensive? And so it's two questions. Getting the investment tracking data, and is it comprehensive?
Yes. So it's will never be comprehensive because there's always folks who are making investments that we're not aware of. But the main way that we get access to this data is through a partnership with a group of local businesses called the Charlotte Executive Leadership Council. And it's a group of CEOs of your kind of Fortune kind of companies that are based in Charlotte. And they've adopted the Opportunity Compass as their primary measure of progress for the region, which is really exciting for us to see that alignment. And one of the things that they asked us as they adopted it was, what does adoption look like? And we said, adoption looks like directing your philanthropic investments to these areas that we know if we double down here, we're going to see progress. And so as part of that, we've had a number of organizations share their investment data with us, and we're able to map that onto the Compass. And we have some of our local government entities as well have put data into the mix. So we can look at where our nonprofit resources going, where our government resources going, where our philanthropic resources going. And then something we're really excited about is we also have data on where the community thinks resources should be going. And we're able to line all of those things up to see, are we moving in the same direction? And really importantly, compare to community priorities to make sure that the dollars are not only going to what the research says works, but what folks who are living these challenges every day says is most important to them.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you for that. There's another question here in the chat. Curious if you have analytics on how many people use the Compass on an annual, monthly basis, and how do you speak to the impact of the data tool in and of itself?
I can answer this just briefly. When we released the Compass, we had about 5,000 hits in the first few weeks. So we've got a lot of stakeholders locally that are using this tool. We do track the impact in terms of the number of hits, but really for us, the tool is designed to be accessible to everybody, but it is targeted at funders and nonprofits. So for us, we have over 100 nonprofits that are leveraging the tool to map their programs onto this to see what are our theories of change. Are they connected to this key driver? That's a really critical stat for us to see the number of nonprofits leveraging this in that way going up. And similarly, how many funders are aligning their investments to this? We've got about 20 funders that are somewhere in the process of bringing their investments into alignment with this, and we hope to have even more in the years to come.
Thank you. Thank you. And David and Emily, this probably is a question I will actually pose to you. And this was a question that was brought to our attention prior to the webinar. How can data be incorrectly interpreted, especially when looking at or when you're juxtaposing different geographical locales? So can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think some of the questions are raised also in the chat around, is this adjusted for inflation and that sort of thing. So I think understanding the nuances of how those statistics are constructed is really important. How they're comparable across time. The data that we have in the Atlas is adjusted for inflation. So module 1, as I noted in the Q&A piece, it's adjusted to $2015, so they're comparable across time. Module 2, we adjust that to $2023. So I think the statistics themselves and understanding what goes into that's super important. Another piece that I'll share, just as an example of our more recent research on changing opportunity, and I'll go ahead and share this one slide. It looked at the differences by race, particularly in the paper and the national coverage that we received. It looked at the differences between low-income Black and white children. And what we saw is that on a national average, low-income Black children experience more relatively stronger mobility outcomes over this time period than low-income white children who saw declines. And some of the underlying, narratives that came out of this was, understanding to what extent is this game of economic mobility a zero-sum situation, right? If we see improvements for one group, does that mean that we have to have declines for others? And so our team looked at this, and along the x-axis here, the horizontal, we have the change in the household income for white children from low-income families and for Black children along the vertical. And what we see with this is a positive relationship. So that is to say, the areas where low-income Black children went on to have the best outcomes, so places like Travis County, Austin, Franklin County, Ohio, Columbus, those are also the places where low-income white children had relatively good outcomes as well, or the best outcomes that they had relative to their cohort. So if this was a zero-sum game, it would be a negative sloping line in some way. So I think this is a narrative that could be misconstrued as we talk about improvements for some groups and not for others. But this shows, in fact, that improvements within a community benefit the broader community at large, and it's not a trade-off that we're seeing.
Thank you. Thank you. There's another question in the chat, but I'm actually going to throw another question your way in hopes that it may be able to speak to the question in the chat. And AJ, the way you talked about your use of the tools was very useful as it relates to what happened, what's measurable, and what works. And you also talked about using data to inform strategy and policy, and I forget the other. There was data for strategy, policy, and there was another category I failed to remember. Can you, AJ, start the conversation? And Dave and Emily, I'm wondering if you can actually speak to this as well. How have you used data in addition to strategy and policy to inform like mindset shifts and case making and some of the narrative work? And the reason why I asked that question is because it will help me understand a sub question. And like I said, I don't want to make this convoluted, but like, how do you keep partners at the table, share accountability, share ownership for the work, and be able to have that data as a leverage? So I know that in addition to strategy and policy, some of that case making was extremely important. So can you speak to that, how you were able to develop processes that work in support of the outcomes you're looking to achieve?
I can take a stab at starting. This is one that I think Sherry would be really excited to answer if she were here. So I'll give credit to her because this is her thinking. When we think about the role of data in bringing folks together and keeping them at the table, I think it's about making sure to be clear that the entity, if your community has, whether it's within the foundation or in a group like Leading on Opportunity, we're not the experts on anything other than number crunching. We're not going to be able to tell you how to run an effective program or make a smart investment. What we're here to do is to help bring this information together. And when we think about our relationships with partners across the community, they're the ones that see the problems most clearly, and they're the ones that are best positioned to find out how to act on them. And I think oftentimes we think that the role of data maybe extends even further out to advising folks on something beyond just this is what's in the data as to what works. And so we really want to be clear that Leading on Opportunity's job and our data team particularly, we're here to bring information together and lift up things that we're seeing within it, but we're not here to build new kinds of programs or erase things that already exist. It's just about that kind of the number crunching knowledge, if you will.
Thank you. Is there anything more, David, Emily, you want to share?
Just a quick note. I think AJ is being extremely humble in terms of the narrative role that Leading on Opportunity has played. I mean, I think that's one of the the key pieces we're trying to understand is how do you create and sustain momentum around the concept of economic mobility? Because as I mentioned, lots of different programs and folks doing work in communities, they see themselves in certain silos, right? Education or after school programs or workforce. But in reality, those are all things that contribute and bubble up to this outcome we're looking at in terms of children's outcomes in adulthood. And I think the Compass does a great job of kind of capturing those different silos and showing how they're interrelated. But I think that narrative piece and continuing to keep a spotlight on mobility as that broader outcome that we're all working towards it's a really powerful step in terms of creating community change that we've seen happen in some places like Charlotte.
Awesome, awesome. All right, let's take this last minute. Any best practices, any words of encouragement, any ways to inform how to fail forward in the most supportive ways, that just anything you want to share with Community Foundations as we wrap up this Q&A. And if we can spend the next minute doing so, that'd be great. So anything you want to share? Concluding thoughts.
I'll say one piece from us that again is credit to my colleague Tanya, who leads our policy work. She has been saying a lot recently, and I really love this. Economic mobility work is like economic development work. We're never, as cities, done getting a new headquarters or building a new building in our downtowns. This is always work that continues to progress. And as we think about the way we do this, seeing it as a journey, that there is no finish line. It's not like one day we will arrive and we will achieve economic mobility. It's a body of work that is about how do we lift up everyone in our community so they all have access to resources and opportunities. And that's something that we should be committed to year in, year out. And so I think this not only connects to the last question, but also is a charge to us in terms of the way that we talk about this work and the way that we embark on it as a constant journey towards continuous improvement.
All right, thank you. All right, we can actually wrap this up on that note, unless David, Emily, there's anything you want to share? We're good. All right, so thank you. I really appreciate your insights again, and more importantly, thank you all for joining us today. This was a very insightful conversation. We're grateful for the partnership we have with Opportunity Insights and Leading on Opportunity. Furthermore, we've been gathering feedback from community foundations across the country to better understand how we can support your economic mobility efforts and provide the resources you need to drive meaningful change in your communities. So your input is incredibly valuable to us, and we encourage you to continue sharing these insights. As my colleague will now share in the chat, please take a few moments to complete our survey using the link provided. Your feedback will help shape our future programming and ensure that we're meeting your needs. We greatly appreciate your time and thoughtful responses. And looking ahead, I also like to highlight some ways to stay connected with CF Leads and continue the conversation. First, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed about our latest offerings, upcoming events, and resources designed to support your work. Additionally, we invite you to explore opportunities to become an investor in our mission. Your support allows us to continue providing valuable programs and resources to community foundations across the country. And lastly, keep an eye out for other offerings, including future webinars, peer learning opportunities, and our signature programs like the Economic Mobility Action Network. We're committed to being your partner on this journey and providing the tools you need to drive change locally. So with that being said, thank you again for your participation today. Please fill out the survey and be well, everyone.